presenter is Nicole Naditz from sunny California. And Nicole, I'd like you to do an introduction to yourself. Tell us what things you think are most important about yourself, and let us know if there's anything that you need before you begin your presentation. And before we begin also, folks, when someone is presenting, what you should see is somewhere towards the top of your screen, a green stripe. If you mouse over that green stripe, then you will see various options available to you. One of those is chat, and as you probably already know, chat is the place where we can post questions and comments, and we, the moderators, will be scanning the chat for those questions, and after each presenter's presentation, then we will be posing some of those selected questions to the presenters. And if Nicole's ready, I'll have Jim hand over the presentation status to Nicole. Nicole, please remember, Nicole, that if you're using PowerPoint, then you need to do the style of presentation that's called slideshow rather than presentation, because presentation won't display correctly. So if you just use that little icon of the screen, that's the right one.
But for Google Slides, it shouldn't be an issue, right?
Correct. If it's Google Slides, it's all the same, I believe.
Okay.
Anyway,
I guess
we'll let
find
you know
out.
if it's yeah, great.
We'll find
nice
out.
to hear you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Nicole Naditz. I am a French teacher in Sacramento, California. I have been teaching since 1993 and absolutely adore teaching, really adore also working with other teachers. And actually, I have taught French grades 3 through 12 in public and private schools. And I've also actually taught U.S. history, world history, health, driver's ed, intro to the social sciences, and I think that pretty much covers it. Some of you may or may not know I'm pretty active in professional development, and I absolutely love learning. And this past summer, I had a wonderful opportunity to attend the PBLL program at SLRC in Hawaii and really learned a lot. And so you're going to find out a little bit about what happened with the work I've been doing since attending that institute. Is my screen showing okay, Stephen?
Yes, it is. But Nicole, you missed something. Nicole Naditz was the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Teacher of the Year for 2015.
Thank you. I don't tend to include that in my introductions.
Come on, blow your own horn.
But, okay, so yes, thank you so much. Okay, so when we applied to participate in the institute that occurred last summer, we were asked to participate actually in an online program that was a bit longer and more in-depth than this one, and over the course of that program to develop a project-based language learning event. Now, I will say I actually changed my mind and did not end up developing the one I used last spring now for their online institute. That was actually going to be based on cuisine of the world. And after coming to Hawaii and so on, I actually really got turned on to a whole other area of focus. And for now, all you can see is girl power, but you will learn a little bit more about that in just a second. So I actually started, dabbling in project-based language learning several years ago. And I did, with my students, they would actually choose topics that were of interest to them sometimes, and sometimes I would guide them in the direction of an area of inquiry that they would then take from there. And so over the course of several years, my students have done things like create a student-created museum that actually was exhibited at our local Alliance Française chapter so we could have a French-speaking audience. They also created community events that were free and that were bilingual so that if French speakers came, they would take care of those French speakers in French. If they were English speakers, they would take care of them in English. And the students actually chose the themes and designed exactly what their outcomes would be for that. They designed the timelines. They worked out what resources would be needed. They broke themselves into work teams. In a couple of cases, they actually had managers for their teams who would kind of oversee the work of the team leading up to those community events. And that actually worked really well. And one of the other projects I did was in collaboration with a Peace Corps volunteer we were connected to in Burkina Faso, which is a country in West Africa. Over the course of our correspondence with her, we had asked her how we could help. What could we do in addition to writing the letters? And usually we get an answer such as, well, I really need school supplies. There really aren't any school supplies here, so we need school supplies or art supplies. This particular year, the Peace Corps volunteer had a different request, and what she said was, what we really need is solar lanterns, because the women are still cooking with kerosene lanterns that explode sometimes in front of them in their faces while they're working, or they may not have light at all, so the students can't study or do work once the sun goes down. And she asked if we could help with that. And at first my class was a little flummoxed and not sure how to help with that. That seemed kind of insurmountable. But I found out about a grant through our local utility to learn about solar, actually renewable energies. And the utility had asked people who were applying for the grant to come up with a project featuring renewable energies, especially solar. And my students actually helped write the grant. So that gave them experience in grant writing. That also helped give them a focus on exactly what it is they wanted to accomplish. And with the grant, they learned about solar energy at our local utility. They, of course, had to also learn French. They developed a website in French on solar energy, and they took the grant money and actually researched solar lanterns, picked the best one for the environment, which is very dry. There's a lot of sand. Sand can be very damaging, so they picked the one they thought would be the best for the environment, found a really good price on them, and bought enough for the entire village, the school, and the mosque, and still had enough left over for our local Red Cross. So all of these projects were very student-focused and very student-driven. What they lacked was, at the time that I designed them, I didn't actually have any experience with the templates and the gold standard project-based learning, language learning that exists now. I was working on them on my own and trying my best to make sure that they were working on both language and content, but I was doing it without really realizing what the best practices were. If I got lucky, I hit on some of the best practices, but I know I definitely missed others. So this year, my students are working on yet another project-based language learning event. And what they're doing is they are working on how it is that they can empower individual and community health through the education of girls. And they're focusing on the country of Togo. And we selected that country, which in the map that is, I could have made it less transparent now that I changed the text location, but there is an area of the map of Africa that is circled. Togo is a very, very, very narrow country, so the circle is much bigger than Togo, but Togo is roughly in the middle of that circle. It's a little tiny strip. And we ended up choosing Togo because when I got my new match from the Peace Corps for the World Wise Schools program, our match was located in Togo. And we did a little research and found that, yes, this is an example of one area where the education of girls has historically lagged behind the education of boys. And there are ramifications for the health of the girls themselves as they become women, the health of the children that they will have and their families, and even the health and the ability to thrive of the entire community in which they live when they have less education. So it turned out that our match with the Peace Corps was going to be a very good fit. So what I'm going to do, actually, just so that you know, I'm going to take you through pieces of some of the template that we used to design our project-based language learning events. It won't be the entire template. It's very, very long, but that'll give you kind of a sense of how such a project is planned. So one of the things that the template asked us is for the context. Where is it that we teach? So I teach in a suburban public high school in Northern California. We have about 2,000 students, and we teach grades 9 through 12. Our rate of poverty is not nearly as high as it is in some other schools in our district even. We have just over 25% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. And that's low compared to a lot of schools. It is high compared to our past. So when that economic crisis hit a few years ago, our poverty level skyrocketed compared to what it had been. We were definitely largely an upper middle class suburb. Our district is what's called a BYOD, Bring Your Own Device environment. So we do not have the funds to purchase an iPad for every student or a Chromebook for every student, but teachers can, if they choose to, have the students use their own devices to provide some of the needed technology in the room in order to access the internet and accomplish a wide variety of tasks. And then that is supported by some classroom technology, and I'm really lucky. I do have Wi-Fi. It's not nearly as blocked or locked down as I know it is for some of my friends in other school districts. Our district has gone away from the LCD projector, so we have HD TVs in many of our classrooms now, and that's what's connected to my computer, document camera, and my own Apple TV. I have my own iPad I use, and I have a grant that I use to get some iPod touches with Wi-Fi for those students whose devices are not working on a day when we need to use devices or who don't have one. We actually have 6 carts of Chromebooks that we can also check out, but at a school of 2,000 students, that's actually not very many Chromebooks to go around, so there are lots of days where there aren't any Chromebooks available to check out, so I depend heavily on my students' devices and on the iPods that I got with the grant for us to always have access to internet and web-based tools whenever we need them. And as part of the template, one of the things we want to consider when we're designing project-based language learning experiences is that it's learning language and learning content, but it goes beyond that, because if we just learn about language especially, and if we learn content, we could just take a test on those things, and we could show that we have some knowledge about the content, and we can show that we have some knowledge about the language. What project-based language learning asks us to do is to go beyond that, to require students to apply that content knowledge and apply their language knowledge in order to begin to address and actually to investigate and address a challenging problem, a problem that expands well beyond the classroom walls. So our students are looking at how we can, as just suburban California high school students, enhance the health and well-being of the community where our Peace Corps Worldwide Match is serving by taking specific actions to maximize the length of time that girls in the village remain in school. And so they'll be learning about human rights, about the rights of children, developing interculturality, and actually we're going to go into a lot more content knowledge now. So as part of our project-based language learning design process, we have to think about language objectives and also content knowledge that students will need. This is one of the things that makes it a very powerful experience for students, because they're not just learning words in order to pass a vocabulary test. They're not just learning about sentence structures in order to prove on a worksheet or a test that they can do them. They are learning language and cultural values and perceptions and so on in order to apply them to also show content knowledge outside of the language classes. So in this case, my students need to know a little bit about the political geography of the country of Togo and of the region, that region of Africa. They learned already about some gender equality statistics for the country compared to other Francophone countries, as well as to our own country. Some of the other content knowledge they need is actually about the role of education in supporting individual health, family health, and community health. As part of this, they're actually focusing a lot on education, so it's important to have some understanding of what the school system is like. How does it compare to our school system? They're a little bit more familiar with the French school system, so is it influenced from the French one because they are a former French colony? Is it largely different? You know, what is the age at which children start school? What is the school year? How many courses do they take? At what age do they finish schooling, if they continue as far as possible before college, and so on? It's also important, though, to start to get into some of the cultural concepts, including family and community life in the village with which we are matched, because the family life and community life strongly reflect and are influenced by cultural perceptions and cultural practices and cultural values. And those things might impact the reasons why some of the girls are not completing as many years of schooling as the boys are. Because of the nature of the work we're doing, I also needed my students to have an understanding of what a non-governmental organization is, and you'll hear me refer to that later as an NGO, and other humanitarian organizations. So what are those? What is the nature of their work? We're working with a specific one, in fact, called Plan Togo. That's part of a national organization, so there's Plan, name of country, all around the world. And we're working with some specific ones that have made the education of girls their mission. And we need to learn about their work that they are doing to improve the education rates of girls. And as I alluded to earlier, part of their content knowledge really does involve having a deep understanding of the cultural perspectives regarding gender roles, regarding education. We can't just storm in with our ideas from an American perspective and expect to have any meaningful impact at all. In fact, if anything, we could have a very negative impact with that approach. So we need to learn about the culture fairly in depth in order to have sort of a pathway that we can follow that will be culturally respectful and value their perspectives and help using their perspectives as a lens to help have conversations and do work around what would look different if we allowed the girls to go to school longer, because this is going up against some very traditionally and strongly held cultural perspectives, which actually brings up another really interesting point for my students, which is teaching them not to just judge those perspectives as wrong, because deep down for us as Americans, for a lot of us, that it just seems very wrong, and we can't just judge the people with whom we will be interacting. And we also can't just come in as if we are saviors, because that is not appropriate either, and it sends very much the wrong message. We really want to come in and empower entire communities, including the girls. So we also have to work on language knowledge, and I actually have a document for learning targets that I had originally prepared for each mode of communication. So I'm going to pop that up now. Let me see what this looks like when it brings it over to the screen. It is well, it's a little bit dense, but it's not too long. So what I did was I'm trying something new this year, and so my learning targets, my grading is actually standards-based grading, so I don't do, they don't have traditional homework. There's not a lot of points per se. Things aren't graded on points. They're graded on performance rubrics that look at the degree to which the students are or are not meeting the learning targets and standards of performance for the work we have been doing. So what I had decided was I'm taking a look at this, and I gave a semester-long one to my students at the beginning of the semester for what a B would look like. And for most of the modes of communication, it's targeting intermediate high. A little bit of advanced low, because we tend to interpret at a higher level than we can produce. And then for my exceeding standards, those students are actually definitely solidly demonstrating intermediate high, but they are actually pushing into advanced low. And so it's kind of giving that sense of distinction between what makes an A. How is it different from a B? So I wanted to be sure that I could provide them this document, and this is the kind of language they're going for. Now, this is going to look very different for different projects and for different levels of classes. This particular class is my combination for AP class. So these students are learning some more advanced structures in the language over the course of the year. But really, one of their biggest goals in order to at least arrive at intermediate high is to be able to apply the foundational knowledge from years 1, 2, and 3, and to really, what do I want to say? And to really be able to fluidly move between the different, for example, in our case, we have verb tenses and so on. One of the hallmarks of being at intermediate high is that ability to talk fairly fluidly in multiple time frames and so on. So you're not going to see a lot of specific objectives about, you know, I can state my name. Well, those are novice level objectives, and so they're very concrete, very easy to work with, very easy to demonstrate. And there are PBLL projects for novice levels where you will see language objectives that look much more like that, the traditional, the can-do statements that are very distinct. For my students, they're looking more globally at their facility and the ease with which they can communicate and the ease with which they can understand a variety of documents that are prepared by and for native speakers. So these standards are much more global that I'm looking for them to show in their work. And as you know, this is being recorded, so you can always go back in later and you can look at those more in depth, because I realize that's a fairly dense document. Excuse me. So we're going to look at another document here, and again, you're going to see a draft list, but we need to ensure that students have opportunities along the way to show what they know and can do, to show what they know in terms of content, to show what they can do in terms of language, how much they understand, how much they are able to produce, how much they can do spontaneously in interpersonal communication. So there are a large variety of tasks. This is actually a very lengthy project, and we actually aren't trying to do it in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks. We're actually working on it over the course of a semester in the background behind some other work that is also going on. And there's an additional reason for that that we will talk about in a minute. So this one, again, remember you can go back into the recording and you can actually slow down and pause to take a look at this. Now, we had to do some work on learning about Togo, and so there's a lot of places for them to journal and reflect upon what they read. What this doesn't show is some of the other things I have done with formative assessments and online tools, and some of you whom I may have had a chance to talk to before may have seen, there's a lot of really great tools out there, for example, for using video and interspersing it with questions that pop up as the students watch the video for them to answer. So when we're looking at having them listen to a document about education in Togo, I actually can run that through a tool that I like to use called Zaption, Z-A-P-T-I-O-N. You may have heard of Edpuzzle. It's a similar tool. And so I can pull the video into that, and it will allow me to crop it, make it shorter, add questions to it that come up as the students are watching it. And those kinds of experiences, there are so many of them that I actually didn't put all of the things into this list. Thanks for typing that in there. That'll be easier for everyone else later. So we are hoping to be able to have live Skype interviews with native speakers, for example, on topics of education. Why? Because I want them to have to also do interpersonal communication and more spontaneous communication. You can prepare some questions ahead of time, but in a true interview that's well done, you're also able to react to the person who is speaking and adjust your questions based on their responses. The trick with that, of course, is the time difference, which is huge. So this is still something that we are hoping to do. We also want to do a lot of comparisons. This is great for language development. It's great also for building and reinforcing content knowledge. They know something about the French school system. They know a lot about our own. What they need to, and possibly Quebec, so they can show their knowledge. And one of the tasks I can actually collect and give feedback on is their ability to demonstrate their knowledge of the similarities and differences between the different school systems, including the one in Togo. I'm hoping that they'll also create a flow chart, for example, to visually explain how the NGO's operations impact the life of the girls in the community they targeted. So that gives them a chance to show understanding, but for some of the students who are struggling to meet the higher level targets, this at least allows them to show understanding of the documents that we will have read about the work of the non-governmental organizations without being dependent on producing a lot of language. So although the target is intermediate high, that does not mean all of my students in my 4 AP class are at intermediate high. A good number are, but I have, in a class of 20, I have about 3 that really are struggling to get to intermediate high. So there are ways to design tasks, particularly comprehension tasks, that limit what is often referred to as the linguistic load, that limit how much language the students have to produce in order to show you that they understand. This also does a nice job of giving them a chance to really visually think about the work of the NGO and how it operates within the community. So you can see they'll be writing letters. They'll be presenting a proposal to our local Alliance Française. They're actually going to develop, as you'll see in a little bit, an action plan. So they have to draft and refine and present their action plan to the NGO regarding how it is that they, from California, are going to try to support the work of that NGO in Togo. So I have some project evaluation objectives, and I'm just going to run through those really quickly. They will probably seem pretty familiar to you now based on the things I have been talking about. And notice the fourth one is the only one that's different. There is one more thing I want them to do in addition to working directly with people on the ground in Togo, working with organizations, working with our Peace Corps volunteer. I also want them to do a little outreach to our local community. So that's a fourth objective where they're actually going to have, as a result, 2 culminating events. Now this is unusual for PBLL, probably not within the guidelines of the standard template for PBLL. One is directly tied to the work they're trying to do with the village in Togo, and that is an action plan to support the objectives of Plan Togo and PCV, which is Peace Corps Volunteer Village, and or at our high school match, because you'll find out in a minute, there have been a few snafus along the way, and we kind of have both now. We have a specific high school we're matched with in Togo, and we also have a Peace Corps volunteer elsewhere in Togo. But they're also going to design a community event for the local community that will be bilingual and has several possibilities for exhibits, but these will be designed by the students. They will decide what they think they would like the community to know. For example, there could be exhibits about Togo, its history, its political systems, its education system, its geography, culture, food, and so on. Exhibits about the organization Plan Togo, exhibit about the impact of girls' education in general, why it's a big issue that maybe we aren't talking about enough here in the United States, with, actually, as Mr. Chudy had recommended to me a while ago, a comparison to why it's an issue still in the U.S. Why is it that we still have to have legislation in place to ensure that girls have access to an equal amount of extracurricular opportunities such as sports? We have legislation to make that happen right now because we have evidence that shows it does not happen in the U.S. if it is not, in fact, part of our law. Profiles of villages where we have worked with and some of their students and families. That's one of the things we're really hoping to get, are actual profiles, or as the French call them, portraits of people from the various schools and villages we're in contact with, their ages, what they hope and dream, what they like to do, pictures if possible, but we will have to see how that works out. So you're probably thinking, wow, that sounds great. It sounds, it's very ambitious, but it's meaningful. It's in French. There's a lot of work with real people. I'm excited about this opportunity for them to not just work with my Peace Corps volunteer, which I've done in the past, but for them to actually work with staff at a high school, to be in contact with the NGO Plan Togo. That's a first for me. I haven't quite gone that far before. So you're probably wondering, how did it go? Well, there have been snafus. So it is still in progress, and in fact, it's still very much at the beginning phases. We should have been well into our project by now. We started working on it in the fall, in fact, in early fall, with some background knowledge on Togo. But the problem was we lost our first PCV match. She was replaced in November, but I got no reply until January due to a very common problem in Africa of limited internet. Then I reached out to Plan Togo and was finally matched with the school in December, but I just got their reply last week. So there are some cultural things here. There's some infrastructure issues here that have slowed our work way down, and we're going to have to be very patient, and we'll work furiously whenever new messages and work arrive from our Peace Corps volunteer, from our school match, and from Plan Togo. We'll stop what we're doing in class that week, work on that for a little bit, and then send it off, because we know it'll be a good 2, 3, 4 weeks before we hear from them again. So we'll go back to some of the other objectives that we're working on for the year. So one of the things to remember is that we're still in progress, and roadblocks are actually part of that process. It's really important for the students to have experience with, what do you do when things start to go wrong? And ultimately, I saw this in a tweet, I think probably on a PBL chat, reminder that it's not about the product, actually. As much as I love the products that I hope the students will be able to ultimately do for their culminating events, PBLL is really much more about the process. So my next steps are to continue in the background, continue exploring media reports and looking for profiles online in case we have more trouble with our contacts. Then we'll work with what's available on the web and build from that, and immediately engage with our contacts when we hear from them so we can begin the tasks that I've described. So my Peace Corps volunteer, for example, if I get an email from her, I hope to be able to answer her within minutes, because she only has internet for a couple of days at a time when she goes into town. And if I wait too long to answer, she won't see my reply until weeks later when she has gone back into town. Be flexible, make adjustments as needed. Really, this process does a lot more to impact our students than restricting ourselves to only a traditional textbook-based approach. So I think I barely left time for questions, but I'm going to let Stephen decide if there's any time for questions. And then my last slide, by the way, is a contact slide, so I'll pop that up really fast in case you'd like to stay in touch with me.
There's definitely time for questions, Nicole. Our hair is blown back, I think, because there was a lot going by.
I know.
I would, first, order of business, everyone, since Nicole is still presenting, there's still that green stripe up above, right? So if you mouse over the green stripe, you'll see options such as the chat window, which is the place where we want our questions to appear. One of the there's a pull down menu there called options, and one of those is polling. So if you're not seeing the poll pop up by itself, please do mouse up to that green stripe and access the poll through that horizontal menu. All right, as far as questions go, I'm sort of sensing a theme over these few days of teachers who are really interested in how project-based learning can be reconciled with beginning level instruction. So if I could trouble you to go back to the rubric slide where you have sort of mapped your goals onto ACTFL standards at the intermediate, high, and advanced level. And maybe you can help us think about, if we were a beginning level class, how might the goals, the product be different? How might the standards be different? And what might the little bullets look like in this, just as a sort of thought experiment?
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so I pulled this back up. I'm going to see if I can make this even better, see if it'll go full screen. Oh, okay. It's a little better. So let's take a look, for example, at the presentational writing column, which is the second column on the left, right next to where it says meeting standards and exceeding standards, just to the right of that. So you can see that in presentational writing for my meeting standards group, it says I can write and publish information about our work for the school in Togo. In other words, they're going to be able to provide to the school in Togo sort of a written explanation document. It's going to be their choice of the work that they're hoping to do alongside the school and so on in their plan. Well, at a lower level of proficiency, what we're actually going to see are a lot more, it's going to take me a second to get there. What we're going to see are a lot more very kind of concrete and discrete steps for presentational writing. So if possible, if you can humor me for just a second, I'm going to pull them up really fast, actually. Global can-do. And because you can actually use these can-dos as kind of some inspiration for you. Let's see, hopefully these are the interactive ones and not the PDF. Perfect. So I'm going to pop up. Let's do novice low, by the way, for those of you who are new to the ACTFL descriptors for proficiency, is so low that chances are even your year one students are going to fly out of novice low really quickly. For example, if you take a look at the presentational writing, I can copy letters of the alphabet or the characters. I can copy a simple phrase. Okay, so our learners are probably not going to do a PBL when they're still at novice low. The good news is they get out of novice low really fast, as you can see from the things here. Most, for European languages, particularly Western European languages, your year ones float around novice mid to novice high, depending on which topics they're working with. The ones they've had more experience with, they might actually kind of peak into novice high. It doesn't mean that if they were given a proficiency assessment, they would be novice high across the board. But for those things that they've been studying and working on, they can peak into novice high. So notice how there's things like I can describe my school. I can envision, and this is me thinking on the fly, as Stephen said, let's see what happens with this experiment. Maybe you have a connection to a school in a place where the language you teach is spoken. And maybe you're going to have the students, there's a chance for students from that school to come spend some time, or students from that country to come spend some time here. Your students may be able to prepare a simple guide for their school meeting this novice high presentational writing standard. I can describe my school. They will describe their school with probably sentences. When you look at the descriptions for what novice high looks like, it will be descriptions that are largely dependent on phrases they have pretty much essentially memorized because they've heard them so much. they are novice learners precisely because they can't break apart those statements and say new things with them and do it correctly. That's what an intermediate student can do. So there are some limits to what I can ask a novice learner to do for project-based language learning, because I really have to respect where they're at, and they're definitely at memorized chunks. Very few chunks for novice low, some more for novice mid, and at novice high, they're just starting to be able to try to use those chunks a little bit more meaningfully. Notice how it also shows in novice high, I can write about something I learned online in a class, at work, or in the community. So he was saying, what would some of those objectives look like? Well, think about the topics that you study. If you are inspired to do a project-based learning program with your students, notice that the can-do statement I have kind of highlighted in blue here, it can be about anything that your students have learned about. So some of my students, when they learn about nutrition and so on, they can write about what they have learned about nutrition regarding what it means to have balanced nutrition in France, for example, which is different from what we consider balanced nutrition. And Canada's guidelines that they give to their children also have differences regarding balanced nutrition compared to our guidelines. So my students, this is a year 2 class, in fact, they do this every year, they can actually do presentational writing and a lot of interpretive work and some presentational speaking and so on the concept of nutrition and the comparisons of nutrition around US, France, Canada, and so on. So I don't know if that starts to answer the question, but I definitely would inspire myself from these can-do statements and then hone in on the topics we as a class are learning about. When it says something I learned, that would be the things your class has studied. School systems in a place where your language is spoken. Potentially things like, nutrition and so on. I think that would be a good place to start. The work that they would do would tend to have to be much more prepared. They will have a very hard time with spontaneous communication, so interpersonal is going to be difficult. So I suspect that the product and the culminating event will be materials that they prepare and share, whether writing or recorded speaking, but maybe they can help.
More so presentational mode, in other words, because
they
have more control, they can plan.
And they can refine.
Okay,
yes.
Since our time is getting short, but I want you to address one other question which seems to be kind of popular, and that is, what proportion of the whole curriculum is this taking up? Now, I know that that's going to vary because as people grow into PBLL, they're going to want to take more and more of the curriculum, but in your case, how much of the curriculum is it occupying?
So in this particular case, this one's really hard to say because of the roadblocks we've hit. It's taking, in some ways, both less time than I need it to, and in other ways, more time, just because I'm spending a lot of time behind the scenes trying to get the connections to happen so the students can engage with the people I want them to engage with. So let me talk to you about actually some of the other ones so you can get another sense. Wrong thing. My PBL background. Here we go. Most of these, believe it or not, were actually able, they worked really well because I tend to do them with my intermediate high students, my 4 AP class. These worked really well after AP exams. It gave them something meaningful to kind of dig their teeth into and really work on and still feel like they were doing meaningful work and had a purpose for continuing to work on their language and skills, because it can be very easy for those advanced placement students to feel like the year ended when they took their exam. And so I actually have found that typically when I do a project like this that is local and I have a little bit more knowledge of the consistency with which we'll be able to do things because everything is local and I know my school, I know my community, and so on, I can actually do these projects in 2 to 4 weeks. That was us working on it almost 100% of the time. Average time I would say was 3 weeks. For any of the projects that you see here, with the exception of the Burkina Solar project, which had, it would be a couple, for example, they would have assignments related to the correspondence from our Peace Corps volunteer when we received it, and then we'd go back to working on other things, a little bit like this year's project. And then when they got ready for their community event, which I didn't tell you about, but they actually had a community event for that one too, and it was really nice. They actually prepared, we did a solar evening in collaboration with our park district and the local utility and my students, and so we did African Tales by Solar Light. And so we used some solar lanterns to light up the area in the park where my students had prepared African Tales in French, and so they would give a summary in English and then perform them. When they were gearing up for that community event, it was about 2 weeks of solid work on just the logistics and the planning and preparing the tales, reading the tales in groups because they all had different ones, planning how they'd present them, and so on. The other ones were most often a little bit of planning at the beginning for the Café des Arts and so on, so that we could look for grant funding if we needed it. So we wanted to make sure the students knew what we would be doing at the end of the year, and then it would actually kind of go away for a long time while we worked on the rest of our curriculum. And then after AP exams, we would come back to it and take a look at their goals, look at any grants we'd received, and start getting into the heavy work of putting together the questions they needed to research, the teams they needed to be in, and having them take over from that point.
Tell me if you would agree with this statement. To the extent that your project includes benchmark stages, in other words, parts of the project that you're working through to get to that final project, the more of those you have, the less upset you might experience if you run into a roadblock, because you still have all these points of assessment, and just because you're not able to reach that final point, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, it's really important to look to develop multiple ways in which you're going to have your students show you what it is that they're working on and doing and learning. So like the task list that I showed, which actually is still being refined, you can still assess a lot of information about their language use, about their content knowledge from those, even if something happens and ultimately your culminating event falls through. They can keep learning the content, whether it's content that's specific to a place in the world, it's about a concept like a global challenge of some kind, whether it's nutrition, whether it's focused on school systems and so on. It's really important to have things along the way. And when we start the intense work on our projects, for example, the ones you see on this page, there are what the students actually help me design the timelines, what their expectations are, what things need to be submitted at what time frames, so that we know that each group is kind of progressing and we can see problems as they occur, rather than finding out the night before the event that group B actually had never gotten anything done. That is going to be devastating to your projects. So you really want to either have your students help with the design, especially if they're old, help with the design of what are the things we need, what order should those things be submitted in so that we know things are going okay, what, and so on. What does each team need to work on? Even having them, it's really good to have them decide the research questions if there's research needed. What is it that they need to know? Because if they tell you what they need to know, they will probably be much more invested in finding out that information.
Great. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, Nicole, for your presentation. I think it was greatly appreciated. And we will turn to our next presenter, Adam Ross, coming to us from San Francisco.